it's not the main goal that we will only have lower transaction. It's not only one particular point, but actually the goal is to have the most meaningful experience when interacting with this kind of technology. Like, how can you build something that you basically the technology will become invisible? Now, for that to become invisible, it needs to have extreme low latency, extreme low cost, extreme efficiency, high bandwidth technology, regardless of whatever architecture. On the one hand, I think the first step was for Ethereum to have the beacon chain, and then the second to export the state to the shards, right? We launched specifically with the beacon chain and with the shards from day zero because we did not have the legacy actually to maintain and do the entire steps.
I'm here with Lucian Mincu. He is co-founder of Multiverse X. It is the oldest layer 1 blockchain with full state sharding. In fact, they were trying to and have implemented the initial roadmap of Ethereum 2.0. So we're going to dive deep into Multiverse X today. It's one of the oldest L1s in the space that's still active, still building, still relevant, I think, technically, but also as an ecosystem. So yeah, happy to dive into all of that with you today. Hey, Lucian, how's it going?
Hey, Sebastian, pleasure to be here. I'm very good. Very excited actually to have the discussion. How are you?
I'm good, man. It's been an exciting time recently. We've been traveling quite a bit. Saw you a couple of times the last couple of months, but yeah, certainly like I feel like there's a disconnect between the narrative and the markets right now, and I'm trying to make the best of that and wrap my head around what the hell is going on. I think like a lot of people in the space. How about you?
100% agree. So I think indeed we've been both traveling quite a lot, I think the last couple of weeks. And I think especially in the last ETH Denver events and especially the side events, I think the institutional side of the industry was more packed than ever, actually, regardless of the market prices or market sentiment. I think it's crazy, and it's kind of feels to be in two worlds at the same time. On the one hand, we have almost all the most bullish news with regulation, with everything that we reached actually with institution, with governments tapping, finally stepping in. And on the same time, I think the markets are just bleeding. But I mean, it's just a temporary thing, and we all been through this, I think, several times until now. And the markets just are just doing their thing. They're
Yeah.
all gonna.
Yeah, actually, I was looking at so we're recording this on March 13th. I was looking at kind of prices this morning, and it kind of surprised me. I mean, I guess I sort of knew this, but I hadn't like looked at the data properly. But if you like the only assets if you've held for the last year that would have made you money are Bitcoin, XRP, and Tron. Even you'd be down even if you had been holding Solana a year ago. Definitely you'd be down if you're holding ETH or any of the other top 10 assets. So it's pretty weird what's happening right now, given just the bullish news to come out of, the US with more regulatory clarity on the way, implementing this US strategic reserve with crypto, having crypto friendly folks at the SEC and different regulatory agencies. I guess it was priced in, but it just feels like, given all of this really bullish news, that somehow the markets are not reacting to it positively. So there could be, looming geopolitical realignment and possibly, conflicts that are also contributing to this. But yeah, as builders and investors in the space, it's definitely been difficult to navigate.
100% agree, 100% agree. But on the other hand, maybe to build on top of that, I'm finally, I think, actually extremely bullish on one particular thing. I think we've been all kind of driven or pointed towards the casinos that we built on top of this kind of technologies. And on the one hand, I think everything that kind of worked until this space, or mainly we took it as a good experiment, it was built purely or mostly on speculation. If we look at centralized exchanges, decentralized exchanges, pump.fun like, or any kind of supply chain towards that, it was mostly built on top of that. So on the other hand, actually, I'm finally extremely happy and bullish that I think the market have went back to the fundamentals. We heard this pretty much all over the X communities and so forth. Founders are coming back to building real and exploring new frontiers of the industry. I think this is something that I'm very bullish about, and I think we're gonna discuss a bit about that during the next minutes.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, let's start with a little bit of background here. So Multiverse X has been around since I think 2017. You guys did your ICO. It used to be called Elrond. People will remember that as one of the larger ICOs and L1 launches of the last decade of the previous decade because it was in the 2010s. So yeah, can you share a little bit about the history there and kind of how you got to where Multiverse X is today?
Definitely, definitely. So I think maybe to start back to the initial story, we start looking. I think prior to starting working on Elrond, we definitely look at pretty much everything what was relevant in the market. Especially also got involved in pretty much even Cosmos, Polkadot, everything that was especially tackling scalability infrastructure at that point of time, and also challenge a few of the projects actually where I've worked closely with to start exploring this kind of path with proof of stake specifically and state sharding. Even Ethereum back then had pretty much nothing about that, but actually it was just in a blog post or some tweets of Vitalik just mentioned roughly the words, right? No architecture, no nothing around that. So we pretty much looked and said, okay, what's the most challenging on the one hand idea, and also what's the most promising architecture that we see that could be relevant even to more than just a cycle, and actually something that will have some very strong fundamentals. And this actually brought us more to the state sharding, like the blockchain trilemma that Vitalik was pointed, that means that actually you cannot achieve a scalability or high performance without compromising any of the three, which is scalability, security, and decentralization. Now, those three actually, the only way to achieve the optimum ratio to any of this with the last discount to any of those values would be through the state sharding, which I'll build, maybe pause here for a second, let you give, maybe ask something, and then otherwise I will just work with you on.
No, I think that's helpful. Yeah, I think that's helpful. I mean, with regards to state charting, like this was part of the Ethereum 2.0 roadmap. Ethereum went in a different direction, implementing a more roll-up centric roadmap and like this proto dank sharding, which maybe you can compare with the state sharding idea. But can you share, like, point to reasons why Ethereum ended up not implementing this state sharding and went down a different direction?
Yes, yes. Maybe just defining a bit the state charting, then the way I look at blockchain architecture. So maybe just one step, and then we'll get to that. So for everybody to understand, like the easiest way to look at any, like we refer as blockchain as a supercomputer, and a supercomputer it's still a computer in the end, which has a computer architecture has mainly three components: CPU, RAM, disk. Right? CPU is consensus. You work with requests towards CPU. The CPU works with a very fast memory, which is the RAM in practice, and then it once it permutates the values, it writes to the disk how it got there. Right? This is very high level gender compute architecture. Now, if we look at blockchains, we have request translates to transactions, which ends up to consensus. Consensus process those transactions. It works with a very fast memory, which is application state. Right? This is the RAM mostly of the blockchains, and then it writes to the blockchain, to the history, to the disk, how it got there. If we look at general compute architecture, how did we scale up any meaningful, even the smartphones that we have today? They did not end up with one thread that has 100 gigahertz. Actually, it has a bunch of threads. I would even say, what's the most like, what's the main difference between GPUs and CPUs? GPUs are especially optimized for parallelization and a large set of parallelization. And this is the way I think I would build the position of sharding. It actually permits and allow us to run multiple consensus in the same time, multiple consensus on the same time, multiple CPU threads, each with their own dedicated memory, and then each with their own allocated disk, everything orchestrated and coordinated over a beacon chain, or so-called meta chain. Okay, pausing here. This is actually just a bit of very simple words, layman terms, I would say, explanation of the initial Ethereum 2.0 roadmap. So basically now we have a general architecture where we can say, okay, so in normal blockchains like Ethereum, at this point you have pretty much one CPU, one thread, everything is executed sequentially. So in the initial roadmap, that would mean actually that the account storage or account state will be exported and pushed towards sub or so-called shards, right? So that would be a subnet within the same network that will be rotating validators and maintaining the same security primitives. But then also, for example, if I would translate into very simple practice, that would mean that, for example, if Ethereum address range would be 0x0001 to 0x00010, half of them in the case of two shards, half of them will be collocated in one shard and half of them will be collocated in another shard. Now, what does this bring? So in practice, why Ethereum, I think, did not end up executing on this. Actually, this brings, on the one hand, complexity, engineering complexity when it comes to composability and atomicity on cross-shard messaging. So this is still something that I think almost any kind of messaging system, cross-chain messaging system fights at this point to optimize. And this is also something that we built and embraced from day zero. So on the one hand, we have atomicity within the same collocated storage zones, which can paralyze the entire execution, even smart contract processing and so forth. And then also an asynchronous composable model messaging system that actually abstracts the entire complexity or knowledge about sharding or something that is outside of your subnet.
Right. How is that? Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And so just to kind of recap there, on a shard, you have atomicity of transactions and application composability. But the issue and the challenge is maintaining that composability across shards. But you guys have built an internal message passing system that will do things asynchronously so that applications can interact with each other when they're not on the same shard.
100%. I think also this is just a temporary, like this is the hardest way to solve, because on the longer term, you could, for example, synchronize the consensus and build, it is just a matter of engineering steps to synchronize ahead the execution needed, where you could basically have atomicity even cross-shard, right? So, but it was just not the main challenge at this point. But I maybe just trying to maybe going back to the Ethereum, right? How did we ended up actually on different trajectories? So on the one hand, I think the first step was for Ethereum to have the beacon chain, and then the second to the export the state to the shards, right? We launched specifically with the beacon chain and with the shards from day zero because we did not have the legacy actually to maintain and do the entire steps. But then on the other hand, what they did actually, and how it turned out to be with the sequencers and the entire rollup roadmap, it actually translated to this kind of proto-dank sharding, which is on the one hand the blobs, which are specifically the slots pre-allocated on the data availability layer, which would guarantee that they don't account any execution on that for the main chain. And then also that also ensures that it is a more effective storage system, so forth, for the L2s. So in this case, where our roadmap with the state will be still persisted on the each of the shards, in this case, actually, Ethereum just serves as a data availability layer, so to say. If for example, Ethereum would have implemented a unified method of reading and writing and interpreting those blobs from within all the rollups, they will end up with an asynchronous, breachless communication within all the L2s. I think it kind of translated, we are doing the same, but without posting the state to the beacon chain. This is like cross-notarizing the headers, cross-notarizing and finality orchestration across all the rollups or shards or however you would call them, but then only specifically would be the part with the reading and interpreting specifically cross data from one rollup to another. I hope I think it's pretty complex. We're going very fast through a lot of many ideas here, but yeah, please pause me whenever you feel it's
Sure. So the like Ethereum has gone a different architectural direction, which is to promote and facilitate applications being built as rollups. Now, this offers like a lot of flexibility at the rollup level, where rollups can choose whether they want to run optimistically or as like Validiums or ZK rollups. And there's even examples of, I guess, like side chains like Gnosis chain, which maybe it's not necessarily like sort of as an outlier. And then this DA component, which is the proto-dank sharding, like gives more flexibility, I think, at the roll-up level. So if we just look at things from a purely architectural and kind of design choice perspective, it gives more flexibility at the roll-up level. However, what we've seen is that it leads Ethereum mainnet to have less control over fees and how it monetizes access to its state. Is that the right way to look at it? Whereas
100%.
sharding actually sort of imposes its fee structure on the shards.
Yes, but not only. I would say the main reason that why we're building chains and trying to do more specialized architecture towards more efficiency and so forth, it's not the main goal that we will only have lower transaction. It's not only one particular point, but actually the goal is to have the most meaningful experience when interacting with this kind of technology. Like, how can you build something that you basically the technology will become invisible? Now, for that to become invisible, it needs to have extreme low latency, extreme low cost, extreme efficiency, high bandwidth technology, regardless of whatever architecture, right? So now the question is, how much can we bridge and fast can one particular technology can capture about that? And I think this is particularly one that I would push and think that Ethereum would still have a better upside if they would deliver a faster execution environment for them as a L1. There's maybe, yeah, it will be competitive with all the L2s and L3s and so forth, but I think at the end, this will translate to even more efficiency, even better experience for all the L2s, faster cross-communication within all of the L2s and so forth. But I'll go back more to Multiverse. We're more than happy actually to do another one only on Ethereum.
Yeah, so like with regards to Multiverse X, like what does that look like? Like, how many shards are there practically, and how do applications decide like on which shard to build? Is it just a question of which other applications they want to be composable with, or are there other considerations there?
Very good question. Very good question indeed. So on the one hand, given that basically the default mechanism is like the address, the less bytes of every address gives specific location on within one shard. Basically, what mostly or application developer have done, actually they choose a key that were closer to any kind of whatever they felt more composable or had more composability needs too. However, this actually, we built it's so-called adaptive state sharding. So this, we just started at back in the days with 3 shards, 3 execution shards and 1 beacon chain. And this actually splits specifically into a binary tree model and gives each of the address. But however, the chain, and I think we ran a prior to the mainnet, so we inspired a lot of Battle of Stakes back in the days. After launching everything successfully, we said, look, let's take the wildest configuration that we can run on this architecture and see what happens. And actually we ran, I think, 50 shards and tried to generate as much in spam and DDoS the network where we as a foundation did not hold any node and so forth. And then we actually validated that the network can actually scale and operate prior to mainnet to upwards of 50 or 100 shards. Right? So this gives us actually the entire upside. The main challenge was specifically to make sure that there's enough economic incentive for those validators, because it is I think to run 3,200 validator nodes, it's kind of an interesting model, kind of different than any other network in the space. But then also I think besides just adding more validating nodes or more shards, we figured out that there's a lot of upside on the engineering side. So even from the prototyping to the mainnet code, we brought 50 times improvement. And I think now with the upcoming roadmap, I'm very bullish actually when it comes to engineering efficiency, again, what would be possible with the network.
So what's on the roadmap?
Yeah, very good question. So the things that I'm very excited about are two specific upgrades, major upgrades. So one, we started with 6-second block time, and I think it was two blocks finality, and especially, for example, 5 blocks for cross shard. So that turned out to be kind of uh, very good at back then, but still given the new narrative, and now we're going back to what I think the narrative for 2025 would be, back to fundamentals. I strongly believe that there is one strong narrative, which is reduce latency, increase bandwidth. I think everything that we see succeeding in the last months or last years, it kind of built up again the entire narrative: reduce latency, increase bandwidth. Sui, Aptos, Solana, everything like that, it kind of built everything towards that. Now, the cool part is that we actually been working on that again for a very long time, and finally, now the casinos are kind of dialing down. There's more room for engineering, for hardcore engineers to shine a bit or come up front. Right, so there are 2 points that we are working on. On the one hand, there's so combining both of them is sub-second finality. What does it translate to? So basically, we're increasing the security of the network to 1 block finality, which is the ideal. Like, this is the holy grail of pretty much any network that people want to build at this point. And then secondly, with the July, I think towards July or August, we're targeting to have a block time reduction from 6 seconds to 600 milliseconds. Then end of the year, 400 milliseconds, and then 200 milliseconds. Now, combining this with 1 block finality and sharding, this kind of position to a most craziest, I think, architecture that someone can build again. And yeah, even if it was built 7 years ago, crazy how far we can build on the same fundamentals.
Wow. Okay. So, like, what kind of technical architecture or like design changes have you had to make to achieve this kind of speed on the finality level and reducing the block times?
Let me just zoom out a bit, right? So trying to again grasp and compress everything to make for everybody understand. So on the one hand, each shard has 800 validator nodes, 400 active, 400 waiting, and there's a random sampling every 24 hours, where 1/3 of the validators are being reallocated towards shard to avoid collusion or any kind of takeover, malicious takeover within that. Now, going back to the 400, so in order to achieve high throughput, we had kind of two models. On the one hand, on the beacon chain, because there's very little heavy execution there, that where we needed ever since Genesis, the highest security standard. That gives the finality and orchestration across all the shards. And that one had a consensus size of 400 or 400. Now, especially if you want to run a consensus where you have two or three rounds of communication with 400 validator nodes, that's kind of challenging, especially processing upwards of tens of thousands of transactions per second, purely because of communication, bandwidth, latencies, and so forth. Now, we solved that. This was, as I said, 5 years ago when we started this, and it worked very good. And then on the shard level, we had 73 plus 1. So leader plus 73 random sampled every round, every single round with yeah, unpredictable, so-called unpredictable, unbiasable by 1 is the concept. Now, this was yeah, this was the initial setup. Now what we're doing, actually, we're upgrading the consensus size because the entire network topology improved a lot. We're upgrading the entire security primitives to 400 or 400 or 400 on all shards. So there will be higher, like all the validator set will at any point of time be actually validating and giving signatures on that. And then there's some new concept that are basically so-called inclusion proofs that will give a receipt, basically knowing that in practice, so in consensus, basically, in order to consider a transaction or block final or valid, many times you basically don't need to wait for 400 or 400 signatures, because the cryptographic assumptions says that if 2/3 plus 1 already gave you the signature, you can already, that's already 100% valid. There's no concept of 200% valid, right? So everything on top is actually just a bonus, which count on on the rating mechanism or economic incentives for validators. But you can pretty much peer to finalizing or considering the block final or closing producing the block, you could already emit a receipt that says, okay, this is already valid. It's already, everybody already has this, and everybody can reconstruct specific, given the data that they all have individually aggregated, they all come to the same conclusion as a receipt. Now, this is, yes, this is a bit of the security assumptions that we built for reducing the latency. And then secondly is on the reducing the block time. It is, I think, again, an entire discussion. I won't go specifically only towards that because, but yeah, it's kind of gonna take another 10 or 15 minutes at least to build up the entire architecture. But yeah, I think there's a lot to share on that as well.
It's like, what is this going to, practically speaking, from the application standpoint, how is this going to improve the life of users and application developers? Yeah, like, what's the actual tangible benefits?
So this is a very, very, very good question. So I've been thinking about and discussing a bit with many of the people or CTOs from other projects in the last weeks. And then I came up to the conclusion that for many years, we tried to replicate and do whatever most of the chains were building with a non-sharded database. So specifically, for example, if you look at the centralized exchange structure data, it doesn't require a parallelized or sharded architecture. It doesn't, most of the DEXs doesn't require that. Most of the specific speculation-oriented application, I would say, don't need by necessity a sharded database. Now, the question is, can blockchains be anything else than just that? Can we build anything? And then I came to on the one hand to the conclusion that maybe we're looking too close to the tree. Maybe we're just looking too close to copy the next Hyperliquid, to copy just the next fancy thing. And then the question is, what's the most valuable technology that has been built on a sharded architecture versus non-sharded architecture? And this is not related to blockchains. This is fundamentally speaking on the technology. And this is something that I'm working on right now, and it will be unveiled as a next layer of application stack on top of that. So, but on the other hand, still compared to anybody else, compared to all other chains, is still gonna be superior to pretty much all other ones because finality, execution time, faster settlement, and so forth. But then again, levering up, what's the ultimate application that could be built only with this kind of technology stack? It's still something that we're gonna unveil very soon. I cannot disclose that part at this point.
Okay, cool. Well, hopefully we'll get to know more about that soon. Like zooming out a little bit and just kind of like looking at MultiversX as an ecosystem and, you know, as a chain and L1 that's been around for a long time. You know, there's like in 2017 when you guys did your ICO and like subsequent launch, there weren't a lot of other players in the space. Now there's dozens of Ethereum L2s. There's new sovereign L1s. There's like Solana that has captured a lot of the meme coin and NFT volume, even though that's kind of dead now. There's just like lots more block space, and the industry tends to want to throw its money at shiny new things. How challenging has it been for you guys to, you know, like I realize that you guys had like a huge ICO, so you're like well capitalized, but you know, I often think like for these chains that have been around for a long time, how challenging is it to maintain like relevance and attract developers and users and use cases when there's just like so many more things being built in the space that, you know, unfortunately, whether like those things are technically viable or viable at all long term, you know, attract people's attention.
Yeah, more than happy to walk you through. So maybe just a small correction. We had a very humble ICO. I think we were at the initial point of time at the initial release of the white paper oversubscribed at 100 mil. but then did not raise anything just to wait for regulatory clearance. And then the entire market felt like it is today. So Ethereum was first time when we released the paper, I think first time at 1,200, and then it fell back to $80 just to get a sense. So it's kind of, if today people are sweating and thinking, okay, it's very bad. When we started, that was even harder, more hardcore. Now, and we raised only 5 million actually and turn it into the peak, I think, into 10 billion. So that's kind of 2,000 times for our investors. I think they can be very happy on that. Secondly, so just to clear that we did not have the pockets, so to say, to fight the big treasuries, but actually we were very hardcore. I would say very hardcore, self-made guys to literally penetrate to. Secondly, I think specifically now, if you're, generally speaking, if you're lucky enough to be relevant and stay focused on your course, there's, I think, a very interesting phase that maybe sometimes you're ahead too early. You're too early with something. You're too early with technology that you're building as a founder. And if you're lucky, literally lucky enough to get to the right timing, you might actually win big time. But this is actually, there's a saying, you can have the best team, the best product, and the shittiest timing, and you're dead. And this is also applies vice versa, right? You can have the worst team, the worst product, and the right timing. And then, so this is kind of a play where I think specifically to that, the best analogy how I build it is looking at CPUs versus GPUs. CPUs are mostly single-threaded, or were designed mostly single, or for many, many years, single-threaded, then built a few threads and so forth. And then it came up, there was GPUs. For many, many years, we had GPUs. How long it took us to build the product market fit for GPUs that will actually build the application, will generate that demand for that kind of technology. Now, looking at sharding was always, it was the very complex part, similar to GPUs, that you could have some demand, but until this point, there was literally very limited architectural applications built towards that. But I think finally we're getting towards that. I think this year, specifically with the AI needs, with the new narratives that are being built, there's a very new, interesting landscape of products that are more than just transactional interactions within accounts, right? So this is something that I think we're building towards with the right narrative, with reduced latency, increased bandwidth, and then also making sure that our ecosystem is very much alive and building on top of that. So I think those are the verticals that we're planning, and then also staying even closer to the head of the curve. I think the part with the US narrative is we're gonna see each other more often there, Sebastian, I think.
So tell me a little bit about the ecosystem and like things that people are building there. And I'm like actually quite interested to learn more about the things that you're doing around payments and helping bridge the gap between blockchains and how people pay, which is with cards. So yeah, if you could share more about that too.
Yeah. So more than happy. So I think first the state of the ecosystem, it kind of built just to give. So we talked a lot about protocol. On top of that, there's a WASM engine or WASM VM that is extremely fast, and we're working towards bringing parallelization into WASM execution on top of that. And then interestingly and very unique, I think, on top of that is the Rust. There are two frameworks, two specific. So you can, generally speaking, compile any kind of a language. You can use any language that compiles to WASM, but we're providing a Rust SDK, which is called Spacecraft SDK. And then there's a brand new SDK for building applications, smart contracts, which is a Swift base, which is very non-intuitive, and I think I think quite unique in the space. Nobody else at this point has any framework that you can build with Swift language compiles WASM that translates to smart contracts in any blockchain. This is a new experiment built entirely by the community, actually, and this is something that makes me really smile, I would say, again, looking how far they can go with their imagination. Now, on top of that, there's AMMs, stable swaps, algorithm. We just launched the first over collateralized stablecoin, algorithmic stablecoin. There's multiple lending and borrow protocols. There's liquid staking. There's, I think, pretty much everything. If I would compare to any of the most successful ones, I don't see kind of anything missing on the general block building pieces, and now just is now maturing at a very fast pace. Yeah. Now back to the payments. I think, yeah, that's again, I would say that it started closely more to MultiversX, but now it's actually become a monster in itself, each of them. So I'll briefly mention that actually it is one of the spin-offs companies. Actually, it's called X Money. It ended to have pretty much most of the licenses within Europe with EMI, similar license what Circle has, specifically when it comes to a stablecoin issuing. It has IBAN account, card issuing, card processing or acquiring business for both retail businesses, and then actually bridging everything, building towards a Stripe merchant API with payment split that accepts any currency to any currency underneath in one batch. That's the goal. I think that's something that has not been, so you could actually pay with Ethereum, pay with Eagle, pay with Atom, and so forth. And then regardless where the merchant will be in the life cycle of the transaction, they can choose their preferred currency and so forth.
Like, one thing here that I think is interesting is, as far as I can tell, the offering of kind of crypto credit cards where you have a card that pulls directly from a balance on chain are pretty common in Europe. So we have Gnosis Pay, we have Wholly Held. Previously we had things like Monolith. There's a lot of different offerings in Europe. Also, the kind of IBAN to on-chain with things like Monerium, it like works pretty well. Like the licenses have been issued here to do that. I don't get a sense that there are many of these products in the US or that it's not as developed. Maybe obviously the regulatory position in the US over the last administration might have something to do with that. But do you get a sense that this is changing and that we could see more of these products in the US? Like, do you have any alpha there that could be interesting for the audience?
Yeah, I think 2 points. So generally speaking, even myself, prior to this administration, I've been avoiding to set foot too often in US. I think this is generally speaking for Web3, and this has quite obvious, I would say, to the other founders, specifically the industry leaders that kind of took a penalty for as an example for the industry. Now with this new administration, 100%, they are open for business. US is literally inviting hardcore builders, and this is the most brilliant, I would say, market to play with. However, it will still take a bit of time until we'll have fully clearance on all the regulatory framework, as you mentioned as well.
Where do you see the space going? Like, I was talking earlier about how there's just like tons of L2s on Ethereum, and I think a pretty solid ecosystem of application chains and more chains, I think, considering going the L1 route. As someone who's been in the space for a long time and has seen this architecture evolve and the infrastructure evolve, where do you think we're heading, in a couple of years from now, looking back, in terms of will we have more application specific chains, or will apps rely on underlying infrastructure in the sense of like building an L2? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, so maybe 2 points. So very good questions. First, there's I'll build again or point to the point when DeepSeek went out. When DeepSeek went out, actually, and pointed and proved that it can achieve even higher performance with less resources need, the market first took a big crash and said, look, maybe there's not enough demand. There's not going to be enough demand for whatever we're producing now and so forth. However, if we look at the internet history, there was never, like, the lower the resources or the cost was, the more demand has been generated over time. And I think specifically towards that, we're getting, and I'm very extremely bullish on how much demand and how things will scale up specifically. Regardless of the markets, I'm not looking at the markets and never look at the markets. It's good to be aware, but as a builder, that's like shooting yourself every day in the foot. You build something that you're visionary, and you envision that you'll generate and push with insane force to generate the demand. And we will collectively generate the demand for this kind of more compute, lower cost, faster transaction, faster settlement, generally speaking. Now, also when it comes to specific applications, I'll take one specific use case where, for example, in payments specifically, we will have a lot of specialized payment channels. There will be a bunch of maybe chains or private chains which will specifically route financial transaction within closed networks or within closed institutions, which will have mostly their own stablecoin issuing on top of that, on-ramp, off-ramp, and money clearance, and then anything else will still remain on their own settlement chain. On the other hand, looking at the demand that we have generated for the entire space, and I think on the more bullish side, looking specifically on the Nasdaq volume. Curious if you have looked specifically on the Nasdaq volumes and market volume, Web3 market volumes over 24 hours, in a good day and in a bad day, because this will also point towards something very unexpected. In the worst days, we had almost half of the market, the entire 24 hours volumes of Nasdaq on crypto. And then in the good days, we have exceeded that volume by 6 times. So this points actually that, generally speaking, once the regulatory framework will be there, once we will spam those networks with meme coins and we'll make sure that they are reliable enough, we will have 24-hour open markets worldwide. This is a no-brainer that this will just, and this is just a humble, I think, use case that I think will generate, at least for a few of the L1s, good demand, I would say.
One thing that I've been thinking a lot about, I think the demand for stable coins will outpace the demand for L1s, because so stablecoin demand is going to increase with applications that don't necessarily need a lot of kind of on-chain business logic, but that do need stablecoins to facilitate payment and facilitate settlement. So if you look at use cases, for instance, in like trade finance, where you have container ships coming from China and like coming to, say, like Europe or anywhere in the West, there's a large number of actors in there, paper contracts, like a lot of kind of legacy infrastructure to make all of that happen. And I mean, this is true across all of finance, but like trade finance and sort of shipping finance is one pretty complex use case where there's lots of different actors, insurance, settlement on delivery, etc. And until we have globally accepted stablecoins, like those use cases are just very difficult. But they don't require a whole lot of like on-chain logic, right? Like you don't really need a DEX to do that. You might need to do a swap at some point, but it's mostly just like locking assets in a contract and releasing them when like some event happens. And like that's a multi-trillion-dollar market right there. And so I think that there's a lot of use cases that are going to require stablecoins for just faster settlement, and you can strap on like a bunch of kind of AI front ends that are like processing information and relaying that information on chain in a more efficient way. But you don't need a lot of like transaction throughput for that. It's like kind of large transactions being settled. And so I feel like a lot of the use cases that people were talking about, around 2016, 17, when building permission blockchains, which was like sort of a big part of the industry back then, are going to get just really facilitated with stablecoins. So yeah, that's a bit of a long-winded way to say that, like, I feel like stablecoins are really the main use case that is going to be developed over the next couple of years.
Fully agree. I mean, I also happen to be lucky enough to work on some of that. So how lucky can someone be? I'll close with that. I think was a very good talk. Very curious if there are anything else, Sebastian.
No, I think we covered most of it. Yeah, and happy to get an update whenever you guys roll out the new roadmap and when there's any new exciting updates happening in the multiverse ecosystem.
More than happy. Sebastian, was a pleasure again, as every time we met. Thanks for taking time and thanks for inviting me. And see you soon.
Cheers.